Okay, welcome. Thank you all for being here today. Um, we will go ahead and get started with some introductions and just a welcome from Illuma Therapy. Um, we're so glad during this busy time of the year that you made time to join in and to talk about leadership strategies to break down silos that align general education and special education. Today, Eluma, which I'm happy to work with and be part of, is hosting this webinar along with EdWeb. And at Eluma, we have been in the space for over a decade now. We support Tier 3 related student services, as well as an end-to-end support for all student behavioral health needs and well-being. And just like this slide says, we're really about online services and student well-being solutions. And we would love to partner with you or provide more information if you would be interested. Today, I'm Brandy Samuel, and I am joined by Autumn Francisco and Mike Letty from Kenton City Schools in Ohio. And I will pitch it to Mike so he can introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Mike Letty, and currently I'm the Director of Student Services with Kenton City Schools. I've been in a couple of different spaces in education, including special ed teacher in our severe behavior rooms, emotionally disturbed rooms. I've been a high school athletic director, assistant principal, and now in this role for my fourth year. So I'd like to preface by saying I don't feel we have all the answers. So when Brandy had asked about doing this webinar, we wanted to make sure we could try to make it as engaging as possible and more of an informal conversation with you all, so we can leave here just understanding what different folks are doing based on what's working for them. So appreciate your time and appreciate you being here with us.
And Autumn, tell us a little bit about you.
Hi guys, I'm Autumn Francisco. I am the behavior coach here at Kenton City Schools. I started here about 6 years ago as the intervention specialist in a behavior unit, and then the past 2 years I have taken on the role of the behavior coach throughout the entire district. So I'm really excited to hear what all you guys have to say and kind of bounce ideas off of each other, and hopefully we can all learn something new.
Awesome. And I'm Brandy Samuel. I am the Director of Product of Services here at Illuma. Prior to Illuma, I have 32 years in public education. I started as a general education teacher, spent time as a counselor, then as a behavior interventionist. I was a special ed director for many years. Always stayed in the crisis counseling realm and have a background in crisis counseling and leading responses to school crises, and then worked also as an assistant superintendent. Um, I joined Illuma about 3 years ago, and I call this a culmination of all the things I get to support students indirectly through all you guys working in schools and do all the things I love, counseling and special education. And so I'm just really happy to be here and us have a good dialogue today. So, breaking down silos, how school leaders can strengthen the collaboration between general education and special education. And we just went through introductions. What we really hope to explore today is just that separation and those gaps that continue to exist between general education and special education. We would like to really think about ways to communicate between our special educators and our general educators so that we can have very clear expectations. And then what it looks like when we really truly collaborate and work together and bring all of our skill sets together, and the outcome that can have, and the impact or positive impact that can have on student outcomes. And then of course at the end we'll have time for question and answer. So the role of leadership. So silos. What can your school leader do to break down these silos that we know still exist, maybe not to the extent that they did 10 years ago or 20 years ago or even 5 years ago, but what can leaders do? And as we think about this, there are three things in all the literature and everything we read: an inclusive culture, but what does that really mean? Shared goals, and collaborative behavior. So, just in an inclusive culture, the school leadership really sets that tone. How do we prioritize our responsibilities for student, and how do we put models in place that allow for open and collective collaboration and planning between gen ed and special ed? And then leadership that's really supporting the dissolution, if you will, of silos really puts forth those shared goals. And they ensure that both groups, general educators and special educators, are all working toward the same goal. Um, Meeting students where they are, using student-centered language, student-centered instruction, and then consistent strategies that so that students are able to generalize across all settings. And then school leadership, of course, models that spirit of collaboration. And how does the school leader demonstrate that special ed's not here and gen ed's here? What does that school leader do? Are there co-planning times? What does the communication look like? And how do those shared ideas come together? Mike, I'm going to pitch it to you a little bit and get you to talk to me about, or this group, what do you really do among these three things to set the tone or to break down the silos that can exist between special educators and general educators?
Yeah, I think the number one goal for us at Kenton is the shared goals component. It's easy for me to say because I have a title that includes the word director, but I think when you look at leadership, and this is stolen from Simon Sinek, it's not about your title. It's not about the name or the initials or masters or doctor or it's about the shared vision, and I think that starts with the culture of the district. But I think too, then looking to the folks who are the ones doing some of the work, your teachers, your support staff, and creating that culture where they feel safe to share their goals and their vision, but they feel safe to discuss kind of where we stand on those shared goals, to build that teamwork where everybody's doing it together. I think is vitally important when we talk about the inclusion setting, when we talk about kind of the growing gap between special education and general education and some of the barriers our districts are facing. Shared goals. It's important to make sure we're serving students.
Absolutely, because that's the end goal, is to support and serve students and allow students the opportunities to make gains, right? As we move,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think too. So the shared goals. I mean, we've got to keep students in mind. It's about
uh,
students. It's about students' growth, and I think there's a component where we hold adults accountable, but
yes.
the students have to be the center of those goals, and that's why we do what we do. That's why we serve in the education space.
Absolutely, and I think that keyword is it's student-centered, right? So with that in mind, and we think about student-centered learning, and not just academically, but within that social behavior realm or within that behavioral health realm, what can we do to come together as general educators and special educators to address or reduce disruptions and referrals that we may see as part of the wider body of students who may be struggling with instruction in the gen ed room? Maybe something's too difficult. And I would imagine there are many of us in this room who can root cause many student behaviors because of a level of frustration. So I'm a student, I'm having a difficult time. I don't know how to communicate that. So I act out. How can we come together at that point? And really, it's this broad umbrella. How do we understand the problem, either academically or behaviorally, or how those two impact each other? Because we know there's a direct correlation. Um, when we have increased classroom disruptions, we have rising special ed referrals, and we have underlying systemic misalignment. So, just when we isolate and think about those increased classroom disruptions, many times we see a lack of differentiated instruction. Maybe in the gen ed classroom, we're not following the accommodations. So, how does this special educator come in and support that without getting out of his or her lane or stepping on toes, if you will? Are there unmet academic or social needs? And again, we have to pull in areas of expertise. And how can we address this? And then inconsistent behavioral expectations. if we have a child who's going in and out of the general ed classroom, maybe to the special ed setting throughout the day, maybe the expectations are different among the two groups. And what do we do to align those? Then on the next note, rising special ed referrals. So is behavior or the lack of the ability to perform behavioral tasks or requirements, is that the issue? Or is it an environmental response? And how can we pull all of our knowledge in a school to meet that? And then um, when we see, and I bet Mike as a SPED director, you can definitely have seen this. I know I have, and I bet there are others in this call. Special ed is the solution for classroom management. You know, I can remember when I was a behavior interventionist, in Autumn, I look at you, I know that you hear this, is I would get called to a school, Brandy, I need you to come help me with XYZ, which I love to do. I love to brainstorm and put in strategies. And they're like, no, this child's going to leave my classroom. And I'm like, well, unfortunately, she isn't or he isn't. We've got to try these things. So, you know, special ed, you know, you'll see at the end of this presentation, I always say special ed is a service, it's not a place. So, how do we all provide a specialized service? And then when is it time to seek formal support? And then when we look at those systemic misalignments, which we know exist just because there are a lot of players involved, particularly when we get to the secondary and a student may have, you know, they may have 7 or 8 different teachers in a day. How do we align all the systems? You know, the collaboration may be limited between special educators and general educators. Maybe there wasn't a multi-tiered system of support or a response to intervention process. So we really don't know what works and what doesn't. And then when we have professional development, which I think you guys will see a lot, especially if you're a teacher in here, when we don't bring our special educators and our general educators together for professional development, or better yet, when we don't include our paraprofessionals, which we all know support in such a robust manner. So for this one, I kind of want to pick on you for a minute, Autumn, and I want to think about like these rising special ed referrals and when special ed is sometimes seen as a solution for classroom management. Is that something that you experience, Autumn? And if so, how do you address that in a positive way to bring everyone together?
I would say that there's always going to be that issue somewhere, but I think at Kitten City we are starting to figure out a procedure and process to eliminate that issue. Um, Here in the past 2 years, I've noticed an increase of special education and general education collaborating together, and I think that kind of falls back on our MTSS process that we use, which allows us to schedule frequent meetings with all of the stakeholders, not just special ed together or gen ed together. It's all of the stakeholders together, including the related services, the IAS, everyone that's involved with the student. Um, and then also having my role, I think, is kind of helpful because then I'm able to be a part of those meetings and hear them. And then I'm able to follow that into the classroom and help model those things and help from outsiders' view pinpoint the issues and figure out what the problem is. And we can actually attack the problem instead of saying, well, here's the issue and the student's got to go. We can try to address the problem within the gen ed setting with the special education supports.
Mike, anything to add there that you see from your office or your vantage point?
Yeah, I think, a couple weeks ago, I think it was a couple weeks ago, I attended an EdWeb seminar about MTSS. And, I think we do an okay job in Kenton, but I couldn't keep up with the presentation. I mean, those folks are so skilled. So I'll be the first to admit that we keep it very, very simple. And some of that's because maybe I'm not that smart, but it's very, very simple. And I think when we looked at addressing root cause, I think when we looked at rising special education referrals, that's kind of where we started. We said, our special ed numbers are too high. So when folks want to discuss a possible referral, let's bring the stakeholders together and let's have a conversation. we kind of utilize an MTSS process, a multi-tiered systems of support process. And one of the things that we were talking about, and I kept hearing over and over again, was, the student had this disability, the student couldn't read, the student couldn't write. But meanwhile, I'm getting emails telling me why we need to meet, why the student might need special education services. And then when we meet, the conversation's geared around behavior. And so let's talk about that for a second. And no, the student doesn't have a behavior problem. Oh, okay, they can't read or they can't write, but they're not engaged in the lesson. There's an attention deficit disorder. There's hyperactivity. And so that's when I went, I sought out Autumn. Autumn was in our behavior unit. She had been very successful on taking students who had previously demonstrated severe behaviors, and just started asking her to come join some of these meetings. And, hey, are you hearing the same things I am? And it helps to have someone like Autumn. So for those of you listening saying, hey, what do we need to do? Well, if you have someone very knowledgeable in the space of behavior and the causes, and that helps. But break it down. What people are saying, does it align with what they're reporting? Because we found it didn't. And then we also took into account, there's a lot of research that shows there are behaviors that accompany learning disabilities. And so we started
Absolutely.
targeting that piece of it, saying, okay, if this is something that we kind of believe in, if this is something that to our core we believe to be true, how can we focus in these meetings to identify what we hear? And then at the end of the meetings to say, all right, everybody here, do you agree that we heard this? Okay, so there is a behavior. And I think when we started targeting specifically items that were being talked about in meetings, we
Right.
started to cover different needs than maybe were reported in our referral form. And it allowed us to break things down to a simpler version of what we wanted to track. And it allowed us to better identify possible strategies and interventions that would specifically work for those spaces greater than preferential seating,
Right.
repeat
Right.
instruction, just things. But again, it helped to have somebody like Autumn who has spent a lot of time, a lot of years diving into the world of behavior.
Sure. I love that, Mike. Thank you for sharing. And we have a question from our audience. And man, this is a good question and this is a struggle. And the question is, we struggle to get time to bring everyone together. Could you share some strategies to bring everyone together or how you structure meetings to be efficient? So, Mike, what are some ways? I have a couple of ideas, but I'm going to lean into you first. But what are some ways that you guide, like your building leaders or even at the district level, to bring all the stakeholders together in the appropriate meetings? And then what structure do you follow?
So again, I think I said earlier, I'll share what we do. And I'm not saying this is the right way, but this is what worked for us in Kenton. And I had spent a lot of time talking to folks who quote unquote did MTSS well. Or people, I was referred to districts, hey, how do you do it? And I couldn't do it the way that these districts said they did it. Um, Time is a thing. Time is a real life barrier that many districts are going to struggle with. And what I would encourage you is, remove the yeah buts. Because what we're going to talk about are things is yeah, but well, hang on a second. We utilize a co-teaching model at our elementary. And so where I ran into, hey, these teachers are coaches. They're MTSS coaches. They've been on the MTSS team for years. Okay, we started scheduling meetings and just watched to see who showed up. The whole first year we ran this program, we invited everybody that was a coach, and but the other part of that was I invited intervention specialists because getting into plan time is a real thing that the negotiated agreement won't allow you to do. Well, from a
Right.
co-teaching model, rather than co-teaching for 80 minutes, what if we looked at co-teaching for 60 minutes and then for 20 minutes, you meet with me or you meet with our team because we're getting SDI completed. We're getting some of the special design instruction. We're getting some of the special ed components done. But gen ed teacher, hey, you're going to have to run this for 20 minutes without your co-teacher. It wasn't super well received at first, However, once teachers started to see that we were talking about the students in their room, once the teachers started to see that we were reviewing strategies and interventions to better support the students in their room, we started to get a little buy-in. And then after a year, we noticed, okay, these are the folks that have continuously made this important. These are the team members that have made this a priority and have continued to show up. And so we started to narrow our team down a little bit. Now, again, for us in Kenton, we have primarily been led by special ed teachers and related service staff members because of our contractual agreement. There's just not extra time. However, even with Autumn, so she now is full-time behavior coach, but she was kind of quasi intervention specialist, quasi supporting our behavior needs, and it grew to a position where we could support it full time. That's another barrier. A lot of districts are going to say we can't do that. We're cutting staff. There's capacity somewhere if you're willing to sacrifice, and I think that was the biggest thing for me. We were looking at sacrificing minutes of the co-taught space so that
Right,
Autumn could support the behavioral component of
right,
MTSS.
right,
And that was just a decision that we made, and we were fortunate to have some backing from our superintendent and board of education. So the time thing's a real life thing, and I would just encourage you to just continue to poke holes.
right,
Find people that want to do it, and then and focus around them. If it means you have to meet multiple times, if it means you have to have several different, we went to digital notes. So those staff that couldn't make the meeting could add value in a digital note, Google Doc. I mean, we've tried everything to bring teams together because time has been a barrier for us too. Um,
right.
but the value added has been a greater reward than the risk.
Sure. And we'll take just one more question here and then we'll move on. But just to add to what Mike was saying about scheduling, and when you talk about your contractual agreement, my presumption is you're talking about like your unionization or your teacher groups, that kind of thing, and instructional time. And we've run into that a lot based on what state you're in. For many years, I coached cohorts in school turnaround, and collaborative planning is huge in school turnaround if you've been involved in it. And it's amazing when we're looking in the summer and we're really looking at our master schedules, elementary, middle, and high, the couple of minutes that you can carve out in spaces to build in, even as Mike said, just like 20 minutes a time. So I would just encourage you to work with your building administrators, to work with your school counselors that might be building the master schedules, and just find 1 minute here or there. And and when you make it something that your staff wants to be part of, it's much easier to carve out that time. I love the digital notes so that those who couldn't attend could participate. So at any rate, we have a question on this that's pertinent here. So Autumn, this one's for you. Could you give us any ideas for some strategies that you use to support special general educators when they're dealing with classroom disruptions? Some behavior strategies for general educators.
I feel like that question's kind of a broad question because I um, believe that every intervention should be targeted towards the direct behavior. However, I think the most common strategies that we see are things such as visual schedules and timers and just consistency and structured routines um, every single day. Same thing with the expectations, like we talked about how the expectations may be different from special ed to gen ed. Well, we want to keep those expectations the same every single day so that the student knows what to expect when they come into the classroom. But yeah, so things like that, just to help the classroom management piece kind of run a little bit smoother. Um, I would say those are the more frequently used interventions. And those are interventions that if you walk into a classroom that doesn't have a student with behaviors that we typically see, which I love to see.
I love it. We also had a question, will this be available? Yes, EdWeb will send out recordings and materials and that kind of thing for those of you who can't stay for the whole session. So next, gen ed and special ed. What is the misalignment? Why do we sometimes misalign? So when we think about it, Typically, what we find is it's a consequence of poor integration between best first instruction or that general education universal tier one and how we integrate with any kind of specialized instruction or specialized support. And what we often see, we may see duplication or a neglect of support that's needed. We may see ineffective interventions, and then we see students who may fall through the cracks. So let's talk about each of these. Duplication or neglect of support. Like services overlap, or there might be a lack of coordination. I like to think about it this way: whatever you want to call it, tier one, universal. That tier one, that best first classroom instruction, what's going on there? A lot of academic vocabulary, a lot of processes, a lot of tricks for students to learn better and put a repertoire in their toolbox. Then we add on layers. So tier two, that's targeted interventions, right? And then that tier three and above, those are our highly specialized interventions that require specialized instruction. Think about it this way: they're not replacing that best first instruction unless we're talking about our students with the highest level of cognitive need, and then we may have alternative standards. But for by and large, we're looking at foundational instruction, and then how do we specialize that? We don't want to just keep repeating the same, but how do we make that universal, that tier one, best first instruction a little bit different? How do we specialize it? How do we communicate between departments? Okay, you guys in fourth grade language arts this week are teaching, I don't know, adjectives and pronouns. What's something I can do to support in the special ed side? Is it extra practice? Is it presenting something totally different? Is it giving something hands-on? When I communicate between general ed and special ed, I always follow this premise: functional, practical, meaningful. And that goes for academics and behavior. If it's not functional for a student, practical for a student, or meaningful for a student, that skill or that information will not be acquired, because kids, as you guys know better than I do, everything must be, think about it, functional, practical, meaningful, or they can't assign meaning to it, right? Um, Staff confusion. Who provides the support? I mean, are we gonna teach one set of spelling words in third grade language arts and another one when the child might get pulled out for a resource intervention? No, we've got to communicate and be consistent. I think Autumn and Mike have said this multiple times today, that consistency, so that kids know what to expect. Kids love predictability. I could go on and on about that neglect or duplication of support. We want to keep layering on. Ineffective interventions, data-driven interventions. And I know for a lot of us, data-driven, we're sick of hearing it. But when you think of a common formative assessment, and we're looking at reading dibbles, or we're looking at iReady in math, or we're looking at social behavior, we're looking at something like the SSIS CoLab, or we're looking at the DESA, or we're looking at SABRES for social behavior, those are common formative assessments too. What's the data telling us that that child needs to learn? What do we need to directly instruct? And when we target those things, then we're going to see improvement, because we're isolating skills that the data shows needs additional support or intervention. Lack of consistent and shared goals. We said right away, Mike said this well, student-centered. It's all about the student. And some of the things we do for students and some of the ways we need to communicate and collaborate amongst all stakeholders is harder for us, but it's student-centered. We want the support to be aligned with the instruction we're giving, and we need to progress monitor. And guys, I've been there. I've been a related services provider from the counseling behavior realm. I've been a classroom teacher in special ed and general ed. Progress monitoring, it's hard. I know that it is. But go back to what I just said. Most of us in this room and the schools we're in are using some kind of common formative assessment. You can progress monitor with that. Or let's say you're working on a behavior skill. You can progress monitor through observation on the playground, just in what's going on day to day. So I think a lot of times, and I know I'm guilty of this, I made progress monitoring into something much more formal than it had to be. And it's a great way to collaborate in your PLC meetings when like SPED teachers and gen ed teachers are in, or behaviorists like Autumn, and we can progress monitor together. I'm seeing this in this setting. I see this in this setting. I see a lack of generalization here. That's all progress monitoring. It's bringing all the info together. And that's how we change our instruction. What is that saying that's become so popular? If you keep doing the same thing and you keep getting the same results, then something needs to change, right? So if we bring in more eyes and ears to progress monitor students, then we can be more collaborative in the interventions or the instruction we put in place. And then students falling through the cracks. A lot of times, I understand we have students in tier 2 for a long time. And it's because we never see a real decline. We never see a real push in a response to an intervention to go back to tier 1. Remember, no matter if we're in special ed at tier 3 or above, or we're at tier 2, the goal is to always go back to tier 1, with the exception of those students who may be significantly cognitive impaired. But our goal with those students, any student, is always that post-secondary readiness. So what are we doing at tier 2? I've seen students, especially when I was doing school turnaround, stay at tier 2 for years and be very successful because they needed a little more intervention. They needed a few tweaks to accommodations, and there's nothing wrong with that. As long as but what are we constantly doing? Looking at the data. Are we going back? Are we going forward? What's going on? But it took the eyes and ears of everybody working with the student. And then when students fall through the cracks, the main things that we see, and I would have to concur, is we delay identification, not putting a label, but identifying when a student needs a more targeted or specialized intervention or strategy. And therefore we delay service. And I mean tier 2 or tier 3. If a child really needs help with comprehension, we're going to teach that. But if we never recognize there's an issue with the comprehension and we delay that support, then that's when we fall through the crack. We have to always be watching. And then we delay, exactly like I was saying, the adjustments to the interventions. You know, I think Autumn would agree with me. The biggest time we really see this problem, though, is we'll go in and we'll put these fabulous behavior interventions in. They're functional, they're practical, they're meaningful, they're not easy, but we've got 3 things we're really trying with the student. And we've stayed in a school for weeks, and we see this working. And we fade off the behavior interventionist support, and I'm not criticizing anybody, but these are hard interventions. You have to be consistent. That's always the word. And I get a call in less than 24 hours after we fade off that Brandy, this is not working. Okay, well, did you try this? We did it one time in first period. It's not working. And and so we want to give an intervention time to work, but we also want to recognize when it's not working. Just a quick point here. And I think that this is where we could get into the most discussion. Mike, if you guys have a breakdown and students fall through the cracks, where does it tend to be, and what do you guys do to adjust that?
That's a good question. Good practice. Honestly, maybe students that have been identified already, students that have had high needs for a while, and especially if they're already on an IEP, sometimes a new targeted concern will come up, and we're trying to lump that in with some of the other needs.
Right.
The other piece that I think sometimes could get muddy. We try not to let it, but if we're working with a teacher team that maybe isn't as responsive to some of the strategies or interventions that are being recommended by the team, I think it's human nature to, how many more times do I have to tell them? We've already addressed this, and so I think people give me a hard time because my answer is always the same. You have to tell them at least one more time. And so we have a belief here that what you promote, you permit. You either coach it or you allow it. And so, when we say that, hey, do you believe that you coach it or you allowed it? Conceptually, people raise their hand. They're like, oh yeah, what you permit, you promote. Yeah, I heard that somewhere. I believe that. Great. Let's talk about something that's not desired. That's happening, right?
Right. Right.
You coached
Yeah.
it, and then people, no, I didn't coach that. They're just,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
well, you just had your hand up. So I think those are the two areas, but I think
Okay.
that's where our team puts a lot of emphasis. And so when we come back to, I mean, once a student crosses our MTS, and again, this may not be true MTSS, I'm admitting that. There are things that we do that may not be in an MTS manual. It's just what we did because it worked for us based on what we wanted to be about in our culture. But once a
Sure.
student is our MTSS radar, they're on it. We review them regularly.
Okay.
And if it's even we have students on an IEP. I know there are some districts that, hey, if they're on an IEP, they're not eligible. Well, okay, then we do it wrong. I don't know. But once they cross our desk, we monitor that and we try to promote and support that team. And I think one of the things to recognize is there are new behavior strategies being taught. So
Right.
we try to teach that with folks like Autumn who are able to do that,
Right.
and so
Right.
we monitor it a little closely so that we don't hopefully lose them.
Yeah. So I agree. It's a strategy that fits your culture, but it's a constant review. Speaking of that, at the back of this presentation, you'll be able to go into a case study that happened in Manistee County Schools and really how they put a good system in place for co-teaching and co-collaboration. I'm not going to go into it. You can read about it. There's even a video about it. So that's just for your reference. As we keep going, talking about culture, perfect segue, Mike, when we think about a shared school-wide approach. So when we unify gen ed and special ed practices, just as we've mentioned here, we have consistent behavior support systems. Students need that consistency across all settings in a building. We have inclusive instructional practices, things like universal design for learning. We differentiate our instructions based on strengths versus labels. What is a child good at? How can we differentiate around that? We have collaborative planning and problem solving. You'll see a lot of these being repetitive, but when we bring things together, consistency, inclusive instruction, and collaboration between all the stakeholders. One of a framework, and Mike will talk a little bit about theirs, but there's several frameworks for co-teaching. And ASCCR, alignment, share, collaborate, communicate, and reflect, is really a gold standard around co-teaching practices. It's really just the steps that we can place in front of our educators to promote mutual accountability and understanding. So ASCCR, align, share, collaborate, communicate, and reflect. And if any of you have ever heard of high schools that work, they really coined this phrase or this acronym, if you will, years ago. And it's just a good way to introduce those co-teaching and co-collaboration. Align, we're gonna establish shared goals between gen ed and special ed. We ensure expectations are aligned. We use data. We use intervention models that are consistent school-wide, and we align our schedules for co-planning and joint decision making. Just what we've talked about. Many of us don't label what we're doing to collaborate between gen ed and special ed, but Mike really outlined all these things of how they align. Share. We share student data, we share our instructional strategies, and we share resources. If I'm a SPED teacher and I have some games or some centers for center-based instruction, and I see my colleague down the hall who's teaching 7th grade, I might say, hey, you could try this. The kids love this. And any kid can benefit from something extra. We want to recognize our successes and what we got from the general ed side of the house and the special ed side of the house. Remember, we're just building on each other, right? We're just growing. And then we use shared platforms, collaborative digital tools, which Mike mentioned. We use transparency and real time updates. You cannot over communicate when you're talking about special ed and general ed. I've had general educators tell me, Brandy, I would have done anything I was asked to do, but nobody even shared with me what the goals were. Remember, that IEP is a legally binding document, and each teacher working with the student should have access to the goals at minimum or the behavior intervention plan. Sometimes we talk about sensitive information, but all the educators working with the student should have those things to support instruction. Collaborate, co-teaching, joint lesson planning, and that integrated professional development. You would be amazed at what can go on just in joint lesson planning, even if you're not co-teaching. Let's say I'm the special educator that supports 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math. If I'm involved in lesson planning with the math teachers, it's amazing what I can support when one of the students with an IEP with math goals walks into my resource room. If I know what's going on, because I can prepare a lesson or strategies to support that. We're going to involve all the stakeholders, gen ed, teachers, sped staff, paraprofessionals, any specialists, related service providers. It's amazing what a speech language pathologist can teach you about communication across the board. And then it's so important for our administrators to be involved and understand the problems that we're encountering and how we can all work together. And then when we break down those silos, oh, we only do this in middle school math. Oh, we only do this in high school algebra. We've got to pull everybody in that's going to support a student. Communicate. Again, we can't over communicate. Ongoing dialogue, clear, consistent language. You know, I know for myself, I bet I could speak for Mike too. Those of us who've been in special ed a long time, I can talk like I'm speaking a foreign language with all the acronyms, all the nuances that come into special ed, and we have to realize that we have general educators that don't know all those terms. They haven't lived that. You know, I was a special ed director for 12 years, so I'm a whole nother level of crazy, as some people say, because of the day-to-day of special ed. I know, like, I have to watch myself. You know, I have to do it today, even at Eluma, when we deal with a lot of special educators. And so, you know, take the time to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. You wouldn't believe of how many new educators, particularly in general ed, would love to know what we're talking about and could support. Um, and then reflect. We always want to reflect what's going on. That's why those co-planning meetings are so important. If you're running PLCs, professional learning communities, if you bring those special educators in, you bring related service staff in, it is so good to get that feedback loop. Remember, when we bring in everybody, we're able to teach students how to generalize across settings. There are lots of kids, Autumn, correct me if I'm wrong, that I can teach a behavior, explicitly teach a behavior over and over and over in my office or one-on-one. But if I do not teach that child to generalize across every setting in the school, will that child be successful, Autumn? No. They
Nope.
kids, no, it's they have to
No.
learn to generalize. So we have to reflect because like I may be having a student that I work with in a pull-out special ed model. And Mike may be the general ed teacher in 5th grade, and Autumn's the behavior interventionist. And then we have our PE teacher come in. Autumn, Mike, and I have no problem with the student. But in PE, there's all kinds of problems. We haven't taught that child the generalized strategies for behavior in that setting because, see, we just expect, oh, he or she'll go in there and they get to do things they like. Maybe not. You know, we've got every setting, there has to be a generalization and that reflection. So, Mike, before we go into this last piece, give us an example of you might not formally say ASCCR, but what do you do? Because I've all of those things I hit, you may not formally call them that. You do those, you've shared those. So how did you really go about this?
You know, again, I think it comes down to doing what works for your district. And I think, you know, for those of you listening, I'd love to hear from you in the chat. You know, what's working for you or what barriers you've come across. But I'll be honest with you, I don't spend a lot of time. I spend actually no time at all talking about tiers of instruction. And I think it's one of those things where I just feel like everybody has their own perspective or own opinion on what counts
Sure.
as what tier. and it gets in the way of adding value towards students. I think the same goes kind of with your framework. I don't have a fancy acronym like Brandy. Again, ours is very simple, and it's more or less, yeah, sure, we communicate, we review, we want to make sure that we are collaborating and sharing. And so, using the example about there's a situation in PE, student comes to our team. Maybe the student has a communication goal. Well, we're going to involve that related service. It's not social communication, it's social behavior. And now we're
Right.
working with Autumn, and it's bringing her in. And maybe the student doesn't need speech services at all, but it's just, you never know until you talk about a targeted concern for a student and you bring the folks that work with that student together. That's when you're going to start identifying things. I don't have a more important word than things, because it might be it might be something simple. We call it low hanging fruit, right? But we want to make sure we address it, and we want to make sure we circle back to it to ensure that our teachers have what they need to implement the strategy. They understand how
Yeah.
to collect the data so we know if it's working. That is a huge thing. I think many of you are like, we try not to make teachers invent their own visual. Autumn does a lot. Autumn does a lot. So I don't know how to create a visual. Not a problem. Autumn will get it to you, right? I don't know how to track this. Not a problem. Well, one of us will stop by and kind of show you some ideas on how you can track it, and maybe help you go through your day to identify when you can track it. But that data is essential for when we come back together. So, when you're looking at, your acronym of ASCCR, we are hitting those things. We are in alignment because we've
Sure.
shared that, and we're collaborating and communicating who's responsible for what and by when, so that we don't miss the needs of our kids. But what we're finding is, from an adult standpoint, our teachers are getting better. Our teachers are learning strategies that are supporting student needs, because they're going to have another student with blank, and they'll
Right.
be better equipped to handle that because of the growth that we've made. Teachers are less likely, there's a lot of research that teachers are less likely to leave the profession when they feel like they have that support. Teachers
Sure.
are less likely to leave your district when they feel like that team is really supporting them. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, and I agree, and that again, my perfect segue right into breaking down silos. When teachers feel like they're supported and they're not on an island, right? And we break down and we bring everybody together, it increases that morale and increases the commitment to students. So for school leaders, again, a lot of this is repetitive, and Mike has touched this many times. We have communication norms. There are expectations that we're going to follow. We're going to use common tools, whatever digital platforms we're using. Clarify roles and responsibilities. And that really comes out of our co-planning. It can come out of PLCs. I know I use that a lot, but that's such a great time to clarify roles and responsibilities. And it really brings that camaraderie and that team approach together too. And then we want to build trust between departments. If I say I'm going to support this as a special educator, and that general educator is depending on me, I've got to build that trust. I've got to walk the talk, and I've got to follow through. Promoting co-teaching models. So we could spend days on this. There are all kinds. Um, I gave you some links in here, but these are the most common. Some of you already do this. One teaches, one observes, one teaches and one assists. We have station teaching. I like to call this center-based instruction. Parallel teaching, that's a very well-honed skill. If you ever get a chance to even watch a webinar or a YouTube of teachers who can really do that, it is dynamic, and the research that supports the growth students can make in that kind of a model is incredible. But I'm gonna tell you, it's difficult, and you have to have the exact right personalities, but it's dynamic. I love alternative teaching where you're introducing a new concept, and it might be in math, a higher level math that's multi step. And you might have your special educator teach a few of the steps, do independent practice, bring the students back together, and have the gen ed teacher teach another part. It's a way to keep students engaged because it's different, right? It's not sit and get. It's engaging, it's more interactive. And then team teaching, both teachers share. Like I did a lot of team teaching back, believe it or not, actually in the mid 90s, and it was the most dynamic, the best 3 years of my life. And I feel like I made a difference, and I loved what I did. So these are just things to consider. Benefits of co-teaching. We support diversity. It's differentiated. If I'm team teaching with the special educator in the building and I have a class that's much more challenging, say behaviorally, he or she and I can get a rhythm going and we can support that diversity. It lowers the student to teacher ratio. I can put groups in my classroom, right? And we can switch those up. Or we can do centers where we run 2 or 3 centers and we can be there. Um, this is my favorite. If there was one takeaway from today's whole presentation, it's the shared expertise and perspective. The number one thing about co-teaching or co-collaboration, and I put this in yellow, it combines content knowledge, general ed, with specialized strategies for differentiation from special ed. And that's the most important thing we can do academically or behaviorally. Bring in the content and bring in the specialist, and then we have the perfect way to capture kids. That's if there was one takeaway from today, that's the benefit of breaking down a silo. Improve student outcomes. There are many efficacy studies that you can just Google. I didn't add them all here, but there's many studies out there that show improved student outcomes when we co-collaborate or co-teach. We model collaboration for students. It's really kids really like to see us working together as adults. And then it just enhances your professional collaboration. Empowering gen ed teachers. I've sped up a little bit because we don't have much time left. And right before we go, I'm going to let Mike just answer a real quick question that popped up, and then try to finish so we don't miss anything for you guys.
Yeah, I want to touch on one of these questions because I feel like this is one that folks are dealing with, like a real life thing. And then I want to turn it over to Autumn just to share kind of what it may look like, from the teacher's end. But how does co-teaching work? When there's 3 classes in a grade level and 1 special ed teacher, and so there's a lot out there that would, maybe that's called co-teaching, maybe that's not called co-teaching. Again, I don't want to get into the argument on, well, technically it's push-in or inclusion. That it's irrelevant to me. So we have this. We have this at Kenton, and we have 6 classrooms per grade. Some grades we have 1 special ed teacher, some grades we have 2. And I think depending on the need for that year, depending on the need for that semester, because it could change, our teachers may have to move to different rooms to service a need. It wasn't a super popular thing at first because we were used to camping our rear ends in a single room, and that's my person. And we know what each other's thinking. It's like, well, great. If you knew what I was thinking, it's that room 2 has some severe needs that we're not addressing. So for the second, you have a chance to develop a plan. How do you think that you could serve the needs so that you enjoy coming to work and you leave fulfilled? I can create your schedule for you, and I'll do it to the best of my ability, and I will sleep perfectly fine at night. But you're the ones doing the work. So what would it look like for you to enjoy work day after day? And I'll turn it over to Autumn because I know she's lived this in our relationship, and then she also sees it from, she's kind of a quasi admin now, and she can share kind of what teachers tell her.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just kind of looking at the caseloads and looking at the needs of the students, and then um, coming together as a team and looking at the schedules and figuring out how not only you can support the students, but how you can support the staff as well in the best way. So it really comes down to you guys and the needs of the students and the schedule that works best for you guys, but it is possible.
And just to add on, and as we move into empowering gen ed teachers, we had a question: how to address classroom teachers who say they don't have time to do any of this with 30 other kids in your class. I would start in small increments. I'm not saying pull students without IEPs into the special ed classroom. Hear me, that's not what I'm saying. But could I start with a teacher that says, I know you're swamped. You've got 30 kids. and there's like 5 kids in your room that I can see, just let me come in and help you with small groups. Or you teach the large group and I'll pull the students that have IEPs, but if you have some other kids that are struggling with the same topic, I can pull them to the back of your room and work with them. Let me come in and help you. And that's one way to get the foot in the door and to show support that you're helping a teacher that's overwhelmed. Or say, hey, any of your kids that it looks like are going to need some more targeted instruction, I can come in and build a couple of centers and I'll work with them as well as the kids with IEP goals, and we can tag team it that way. I can tell you that it's worked in buildings I've been in. So we'll keep
Brandy, can I
going.
add to that really quickly?
Yes.
So another thing as someone that comes in from the outside is when we have these meetings, teachers may feel like we're giving them all of these things to implement in their classroom, which causes them to be overwhelmed with their other kids. So it's just to be mindful of what they're able to do. So yes, they do have 30 other kids, so we need to be mindful of that. So picking one intervention at a time and making it the simplest but yet most effective. And like when it comes to data collecting, letting them know they don't have to collect data all day. Just choosing those specific time periods that would be best. So kind of being mindful of, yes, they do have 30 other kids, and what is the least work but most effective, so they don't feel overwhelmed, and how we can support them doing that.
So empowering general ed teachers, support for inclusive teaching. And I'm like Mike, it doesn't matter to me if you call this inclusion, push in, whatever. The label doesn't matter. But when we're going to begin, or we're going to have co-teaching, or we're going to have co-planning, we've got to have professional development that keeps everybody up to date on best practice and everybody aligned. It might be inclusion strategies. It might be differentiation. It might be behavior supports. And I really love Autumn's point of pick one intervention that works for the whole group. Um, it might be co-teaching models. It's amazing the buy-in you can get when people become educated, and you want to go in with the most simple way first. You know your staff, and that's why, what are there, 8 different co-teaching models that we presented? There's all ways to go about this. You want to include gen ed and special ed perspectives. Everybody wants to be heard. And then when you embed professional learning into your school schedule or into your PLCs, it's much more effective because it's like Mike said, time is a real thing. Time is money. And when we don't appear to waste time, we have better buy-in. Access to coaching and resources, any kind of instructional coach or mentor to help support your pairs or your triads or your grade levels or subject areas. Access to tools, just like Mike said, they can provide the visual support. What kind of assistive tech works? What kind of scaffolding materials? Again, when we co-plan, I can share with my neighbor different strategies that have worked for me, and I can ask them. We've got to break down. It's not competitive. Do not reinvent the wheel. Let's help each other because, again, time is of the essence. And if somebody's already built something or has something that works, let's use it. And then we want to have shared responsibility for all learners. All of us as educators are responsible for every child that walks in our building. When I hear an administrator say, "Oh, they're special ed," no, they're a student at your school. Everybody is a general education student first because they're part of the general population that walks in your building. When they need specialized instruction, they receive service that is differentiated and specialized. They are not special ed when they walk in your building. All of the kids belong to everybody in that building. Everybody has responsibility for learning, post-secondary readiness, and outcomes, improved outcomes. We want to always reinforce this, and we want to promote that problem solving academically and behaviorally with all relevant stakeholders. Everybody in our buildings are responsible for our students. It's amazing how much the custodian, the bus driver, the nurse, the secretary know about students that none of the rest of us know because they see those students in an informal setting. You would be amazed what you can learn from all the different players and contributors to the working of a school. And fostering a culture of growth. We always want our kids to be growing. Remember, doesn't matter what tier they're at, they're always the goal is to be back down here with best first instruction being the primary need. And we get there a lot of times. Sometimes we don't, and we put those supports in, but that's always the goal. So, how do we build a resilient and adaptive team? Back to that reflective practice. Mike said, yeah, we reflect what's working and what's not. We don't want to keep repeating the same patterns. We want to look at the data, make adjustments. If Autumn and I are collaborating together or co-planning and we're like, this is just not working. Let's scrap it and start over. It's okay. There's nothing you can't correct. Just recognize we need to make a change. We want to create safe spaces for learning and sharing. I feel like we need to normalize any questions that come to play when we're co-planning or in our professional learning communities or staff meetings, or if we're just in a staffing meeting that support a child's IEP or maybe their tier 2 intervention. Everybody needs to have a voice and we need to respect that. And again, it's amazing what different groups come with. If a child has occupational therapy services and you've never included them in a PLC, think about it. Because if you're not aware, occupational therapy supports motor planning. How many academic activities or behaviors do we expect children to perform that require motor planning? And we've never received input from the occupational therapist. Even if the child doesn't have an IEP, and it doesn't just have to be a fine motor skill, motor planning is a big thing for students, particularly students with some neurodiverse needs. And then celebrate collaborative successes. When we work together I'm going to use a student with, let's say we're using a student who has the issues with emotional regulation. Perhaps they have the label of emotional disturbance. The label's not the issue for the child. It's the lack of behavioral regulation across settings. And we're able to work collaboratively with special educators and general educators to get a child participating over a certain amount of time in that gen ed setting with no support. We need to celebrate that because that's a big deal because we work together to to get that child functioning across multiple settings, and that's huge. I mean, Autumn, this is what she lives every day. Our goal at first may just be to get a child into 1 hour a day, one day time a week, and then we work up to 2 hours. So that's a success, guys, because it took everybody working together to support that child, and we need to celebrate that. And then in conclusion, takeaways and call to action. We got to take those barriers down between gen ed and special ed. I'm always going to go back to my saying functional, practical, meaningful. Special education is a service, not a place. The place is the school building. We're providing a service to our students. We need to prioritize systems and level our collaboration. None of us are going to get anywhere unless we're working together to support a student. A student needs all of us. A lot of you guys may be in mental or behavioral health and you hear about wraparound systems of support. What is a school team? The general educators, the special educators, the related service, the administrators. That's wraparound support. That's all that is. Doesn't matter what we call it, tiered support, MTSS, PLCs, we're a wraparound for each student. And then we always want to lead with intention. What's the intent of this intervention? What's the intent of this collaboration? How do we empathize with other adults working with a child? And what strategies are we going to use to tap into a child's strengths? And then Mike or Autumn, as we think about those takeaways and the call to action, what's one final word or, summary that you could give to best support students, but mainly staff in reaching our students through collaborative efforts?
I think for me, I would tell you to keep it as simple as you need to. In our space, there's so much thrown at us that I think when we simplify things and do a few things really well, there's this extravagant toolbox of things. So, but you have to do what works for you, and maybe that doesn't fit the mold, but it fits where you and your staff are. It fits your culture. That to me is the most important thing: is staying true to who you are or who you guys want to be, and stay in that space rather than do or conform to what your state association tells you to be or what the national norm looks like. So kind of focus more on that and serve your people based on your needs and your culture versus trying to compare or fit a different mold.
Agreed, Mike. Well said. Autumn, anything for you?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is to continue to find ways to improve your communication and collaboration. Once again, going back to inviting all of the stakeholders, including related services, including the gen ed teachers, ISs, educational assistants, to collaborate together because I feel like that's when um, the most growth is made.
I agree. I agree. I know that we have run a little short on time. We've tried to get to the questions that were in the question and answer and in the chat. Um, just as you plan with your schools, think about what could co-teaching mean to you? How could we just start with cross-departmental collaboration? And that might be where you have to start. Maybe you don't collaborate now, but that's a starting place. I love, what Mike and Autumn have both said about keep it simple, focus on one or two things. I always say never more than three. It's better to do one thing really well than to try to do 10 things less than mediocre. And then here's uh, my philosophy: special education is a service, it's not a place. And the days of us evaluating students in special education and them going to a place or a room or a different building, those days have kind of passed us by, because we can serve students so much better in an inclusive environment where everybody's coming together to support our students. And any references are here. Also, you're happy to reach out to Illuma via email, and I can route your questions. They can come to me or Mike or Autumn. We're happy to answer.